Welcome to part two of our lecture for Module 3. It is creating an accessible learning environment. So, to begin this conversation, I do want to say that I'm not discussing the actual things that you can't change. This focuses on the things that you can. So, our reading that we have for this week I thought was pretty cool because it's pretty much a booklet for creating inclusive, learning friendly environments specialized for students with disabilities. It's like your toolkit. So, the idea is that you don't go through the whole thing. For the actual module, that you print this out and use it as your handbook. To enable you to be successful. So the parts that you'll stop at page 20, and then what I mean by stop is you'll use the other parts as useful resources that you can come back to whenever you would like to. And we'll probably cover a few of these things later on in the course as we thoroughly discuss some of the disabilities that students will be challenged with and how those can impact the environment of a class. But all in all, you only need to do or focus on chapters 1 through 20 for the actual reading part, and then pages 1 through 20 for the reading part, and then pages 27 through 92 for the actual application of what was learned. So you'll see what I'm saying when we get to the quiz. But here's our reading, and I thought that this was actually pretty great reading, so I hope you find it very resourceful. And for those of you who currently teach within a special needs environment, this probably will be something that you can add to your resources. So I'm just going to jump right on in. I skipped the objective for this recording only because I felt like, well, pretty obvious. So, what are barriers to learning, development, and participation? What are barriers to learning, development, and participation within a classroom? So, the barriers to learning could include development and participation. Children face will vary from one child to another. You have to consider the individual student when you think about the types of barriers that they may face within these three different areas, but they do have a strong impact on the experiences. So barriers may therefore be experienced temporarily or permanently. Remember that it depends on the situation. So for example, and then how effectively they are addressed. So for example, I had a student in my class that was he's colorblind, and he described to me how, and he just got these new glasses that provide him with color within his vision. But he described to me a situation where a teacher had a PowerPoint that had, I think it was a black background, and he couldn't see the screen. And the teacher got kind of like testy with him and said, "Well, why aren't you writing down the notes?" And then he had to tell her, "I'm colorblind, miss. I can't see that." So that's a temporary barrier that caused him to be unable to record the notes, but it happens. So that's why it's important for us to consider each student's differences and their individual needs, and how that barriers the barriers that are particular to their situation can impact their learning, development, and overall participation. So it also says children with disabilities face both environmental and individual barriers. So these two forms of barriers are closely interrelated. Now let's get into the details. Environmental and attitudinal barriers to learning. So what I did was, in addition to some minor errors, my apologies, I tried to focus in on the key things that the reading highlighted, but you'll have to do a little bit more reading to get all of it, the very detailed parts of it from pages 1 through 20. So the first thing, limited or no access to early intervention programs. These are barriers to learning. Teachers, school administrators, and school inspectors that discriminate against students, legal and regulatory systems that exclude or discriminate or even segregate students with disabilities. And then you have environmental attitudinal barriers that are curricula related, and then teaching approaches and teaching/learning materials, like the example that I gave with the slides, and then assessment and evaluation systems that are not fair to students or exclude them. And then the last two include school and classroom environments when they're not inclusive or are not learning friendly or even physically accessible for students. And then there's social, economic, and political conditions that may impact the learning and the participation and the development areas. So let's get into some things. So I don't always like to focus on the negative or on the how the challenge of the impact. I like to give you resources. So I wanted to do a general review of some of the areas of barriers. I encourage you to go back and look over it, only because of the fact that you have your individualized students, just like the example that I gave, and there's kind of no exact way for me to say to you, hey, this is going to be a barrier for your student. So I thought it would be pretty useful for you to look at the universal design principles of learning in a method of you creating a more accessible environment, not just from the content level, but also from the actual literal physical environment and how you set it up. So principle 1, equitable use. The design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities, people both with and without disabilities. So that means that whatever is in the classroom, it should be used, it should be accessible and useful or usable to everyone within the environment. Flexible in use, it says design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. There shouldn't only be one preference style. For example, I have students who have vision challenges. They may not have a labeled disability. However, they have the option to take pictures of things and then jot them down later, or have the digital access of it, or have the audio version of it. Principle 3, simple and intuitive use. The use of the design is easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. I have a reminder board in my classroom to help students figure out things very simply so that it's not a challenge for them to actually get to the what they need to get. Also remember principle 4, perceptible information. The design effectively communicates necessary information to the users, regardless of the ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. So there shouldn't be a barrier to someone being able to perceive information that you present. Also, tolerance for error. I thought this one was pretty interesting because sometimes we don't always consider these things. The design minimizes hazards and adverse consequences of accidental or unattended action. So one of the things I didn't always consider was this. And this year I purposefully put everything aligned to the back end of the wall of my classroom because it's kind of tiny. We have a lot of desks. For whatever reason, they put me in the tiniest room, which is typical. And I have about 45 desks in there, and students need supplies. So I thought, well, where can I put these where it's not a problem, where cords are not hanging out and things of that nature? So I made sure that their supplies, and I'm getting the supplies, would not be a handicap for them. So and the reason for that is because, say, for example, a student gets, they break their leg, which one of my students did. They're not tripping over cords and wires because now they're challenged with accessibility due to their condition of their leg, even if it's temporary, and cords and different things that are in their way can become a problem. So consider the design minimizes hazards. That would be a hazard, a cord, and the adverse consequences of accidental or unattended action. So how you choose to handle when students don't do necessarily what they're supposed to do, or what you thought would happen in an environment where there is a tricky situation where a cord is hanging out or a desk is in the place, that doesn't make it conducive for someone to walk around who's differently abled when they're in the environment. So last two principles: low physical effort, the design can be used efficiently and comfortably with a minimum of fatigue. And then principle 7, appropriate size and space. So this is considering the posture in a desk. You can't really control that, but you can, I guess, if the desks are just like crazy uncomfortable for the students, I guess you could advocate for some tables. Going back to principle 6, I think that one really matters. So um, fatigue, when I think about fatigue for my class, I think about mental fatigue and actual physical fatigue. I guess when it comes to writing, I like to take breaks in between notes. I don't do more than 4 slides, if not less than that, because the students can't handle it. They're going through an entire day where they're writing, and it just, wow, sometimes by the end of the class it's just too much for them. So I consider different ways to minimize or lower their physical effort through different games and activities that will support that challenge. Wrap up. So I want you to take a close look at the examples. Make sure you review the rest of the booklet at your convenience and consider alterations to your current setting. This has been fun. I think the application of this will be even more enjoyable. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Have a fantastic week and a great rest of your weekend.